The preview began with screams, splattered blood, and a horde of undead advancing as people ran desperately in all directions. An explosion echoed in the middle of the battle. Two warriors clashed their weapons forcefully. The human gathered every fragment of energy and launched a powerful attack. His blow was intercepted and returned by his opponent, causing another explosion. He planted his sword in the ground. Eos, recognized as the strongest swordsman in the Empire, declared his admiration for the strength of his opponent, the Death Knight. But that enemy had not escaped unscathed either. His armor was compromised, and his helmet had been destroyed. The knight clutched his wounded face and began to tremble strangely until he managed to compose himself. He looked surprised, reflecting on what this meant. He had finally achieved what he sought, he thought. The surrounding scenery burned in flames. For him, this was excellent. As the skeleton expressed, he had finally obtained the result he had pursued for so long: to annihilate the Empire with his own hands. The revenge of his people had finally been perfectly completed. That was Dorgo, the Lord of Hell. Howard Adel, the Emperor of the Helios Empire, wept and cursed Dorgo for massacring his people, claiming they treated him like a joke. To the skeleton, being cursed sounded almost like a compliment. Dorgo asked if the Emperor had finished complaining, for the time of the coronation had arrived. That would be his reward for uniting the entire continent. He declared that he needed to be acclaimed as the sole emperor. Kor, powerless, simply accepted the situation. They had lost. The Lord of Hell resorted to his final tricks. He ordered the demon kings and infernal creatures to bring the imperial crown. Among them appeared the knight seen at the beginning, carrying the crown. Dorgo praised him especially, calling him his most loyal knight and responsible for the decisive point of the battle. He asked what kind of reward the warrior desired. The knight remained silent. Dorgo reflected on his own words and concluded that it made no sense to reward a slave. The follower threw the crown into the air, confusing the skeleton, and the knight attacked Dorgo, destroying the crown at the same time. The others watched without reacting. With his hands raised, the Lord of Hell created a defensive barrier. His followers immediately positioned themselves before him, raising their weapons. Dorgo asked the knight what he thought he was doing. He seemed disconcerted. That attack had caused damage despite his defenses. Finally, the knight spoke. He said it had taken a while, but now he could move his own body at will. Dorgo didn't understand. He was sure he had completely erased the warrior's consciousness, but he was wrong. The knight had been observing everything from within, imprisoned in his own body, hating every action he was forced to commit. Dorgo couldn't lose control at that point. He sent his followers after the traitor. The knight prepared himself and delivered a devastating blow, surprising the Lord of Hell. This couldn't be real. His most powerful weapons were destroyed with a single attack. Dorgo raised his hand, activating his ability to resurrect the undead and sending an entire horde against the knight. He ordered them to stop, saying they were nothing but trash, and extended his hand, concentrating his power. He clenched his fist. The creatures screamed and exploded into countless fragments. Dorgo was left alone. He couldn't believe the mistake he had made in the final instant. He had created a monster comparable to the gods themselves. Okay. He knew everyone was excited. The skeleton tried to calm the knight, reminding him that dying wasn't so problematic since he could transfer his soul to another body and regain mental control. The knight raised his weapon and gathered energy. He commented that, during all those years, he had only thought about eliminating him. That's why he had created a technique capable of directly targeting the soul, preventing any escape. For Dorgo, this was inconceivable. Something like this shouldn't exist. The knight cut through the skeleton. A second passed without anything happening. Dorgo concluded that this couldn't be real. Then he screamed in agony to the sky. A lightning bolt appeared and shot from his body, disappearing into the clouds. It was the end. Dorgo exploded instantly, leaving only his skull. The knight walked towards him and lifted his foot. He murmured, "Go to hell," crushing the remains with ease. Howard watched everything from afar, completely bewildered by what had happened. The knight fell to his knees. Nothing was finished. Only one last task remained: to apologize to all the beings he had ended up killing with his own hands. Even without control over his actions, it was he who had done it. He wished to beg forgiveness, and although he knew he wouldn't go to the same place as them because of his own sins, He still wanted to ask forgiveness from his family, so he decided to end his own life. Thus ended the knight's existence. He could finally rest. In the darkness, a voice called the protagonist. He opened his eyes and recognized who was calling him. He felt joy at seeing her one last time, even if it was just for a moment. But something surprised him. Why did his body seem so young? His older sister smiled, not expecting praise. As a sign of gratitude, she said she would help him when their father tried to punish him. He walked straight home, analyzing everything around him with bewilderment. He was sure he had destroyed that place. He questioned whether it was a dream, or if all the previous chaos was just an illusion. He looked for a branch, hoping to find it quickly, and touched the tip to a stone. He advanced with precision and struck. The branch broke, and the protagonist was perplexed. He thought it was absurd. At the same time, he smiled as the stone began to crack until it shattered into pieces. The boy trembled, incredulous, but found it extraordinary. He laughed as if he were losing control. He fell to his knees and the rain began to fall. With his other hand, he pulled at his own hair in despair. He understood that this was not a dream. He had truly returned to the past, and yet it still seemed impossible to him. The protagonist's name was Damien, and that was, in fact, the name he bore, without inventions or exaggerations. From a young age, he demonstrated an almost natural talent for causing displeasure within his own family, which is why he was constantly reprimanded and punished by his father or brother. After a serious argument, his sister was forced to marry a despicable man. That had become the breaking point for Damien. He had lost possessions, family, and honor in a single blow. As a final consequence, his own father had expelled him. However, before he left, his sister called him and handed him a bag of money. Even after everything he had caused, she sincerely wished that her brother would find some happiness. Damien was completely stunned, impressed, and speechless. He thought he was responsible for ruining her destiny. And yet she, trembling, handed him the money and fled, abandoning everything behind. At that moment, he understood for the first time the weight of guilt and shame. Now, the same boy was trying to understand how he had managed to travel through time. He wanted to reconcile with his family, that was true. But he questioned whether it was really some kind of divine intervention. Damien looked at his aching hand. Using that technique with the stone had been a regrettable decision. He possessed the ability to amplify techniques like Wave Breaker, a skill capable of multiplying the impact of blows. And he had acquired this power after defeating the knight known as Wall Breaker. It was then that he heard his name again. Someone was running towards him while he was still lying on his back. She recognized the family servant and tried to remember his name. Victor? It seemed to be him. He had come only to remind the young master that he should return immediately to the mansion at the request of Miss Lois, his sister. Damien questioned the reason, but Victor had no answer. He only knew that the patriarch was furious. With no alternative, Damien would need to find out what was happening personally. Inside the county of Haxon, or Axon, as some called it, a scream echoed. Someone was advancing to kill him, forcing him to dodge. When she turned around, the assailant seemed even more enraged. It was her own father, while some servants held him back. Paul cursed him for causing more trouble. How dare he cause a commotion in a tavern amidst that turmoil? And at that moment Damien finally recognized where in his life he had stopped and, above all, how much time had passed since his father's last reprimand, when his mother and brother were still trying to defend him. He could see how much he had missed them. The situation was chaotic. Everyone was perplexed. Damien, known for his shamelessness, was crying, and yet Paul Osborne, wouldn't let him breathe and demanded explanations. The protagonist stated that he had no excuses. Of course not, Paul replied. Wait, what did you just say? What do you mean by no excuses this time? He seemed incredulous. The boy repeated that he had no excuses. He admitted that he had dishonored Viscount Haxon with his behavior and accepted the blame without trying to justify it. Paul sighed indignantly. An apology wouldn't solve much. Damien then bowed and offered to mend the damage. He walked to the door and, before leaving, declared that he would correct the mistakes he had made and that everyone should be prepared to administer the deserved punishment when he returned. His family remained in absolute silence. They wondered if they had heard correctly. To them, the boy was ungrateful, perhaps too confused, or had hit his head. Soon after, they headed to the trading city of Landwer. Victor accompanied Damien to the tavern. "Are you sure you want to go back?" the servant asked. Rumors were circulating that the syndicate had connections to that place. Damien continued walking without hesitation and suggested to the servant that he return to the mansion. His only purpose was to apologize to the owner and make amends for what he had done. In his thoughts, he repeated that everything needed to be right. He didn't understand how he had returned to the past. But if this was a second chance granted by God, he would do everything possible to act correctly. He wouldn't allow his loved ones to suffer again. He would fix everything, step by step. The guards were surprised to see him and reacted with irritation when questioning the reason for his return. Damien searched his memory but couldn't identify who the men were. Still, he explained that he had come to apologize to the owner for the incident the previous night. The two guards exchanged perplexed glances and mocked him. They considered the situation absurd, since, for them, being merely the troubled son of a noble family was no reason for respect. Then, they mentioned Lois, saying she was too beautiful for that family. One of them touched Damien's face provocatively. The bandit demanded his sister's hand in marriage as compensation for what had happened. Damien snatched the knife from his hand. Even though he only intended to apologize, the situation worsened. The guard threatened him and ended up having his hand cut off. The man stared at the severed limb and only then began to scream in pain. His companion drew his sword. Damien stood up and declared that he would show what the troubled son of the Axon family was capable of. He had also noticed everything thanks to Victor, who was hiding among the houses. It was impossible that the attempt to apologize had turned into another confrontation. The shouts echoed through the streets, attracting the attention of onlookers. The other guard tried to intimidate him by mentioning the name of the Black Serpent. For them, touching members of that organization was unforgivable. The name brought back memories for Damien. The Black Serpent was an organization that was growing unchecked at that time. That tavern was one of their bases, and when he had complained about the exorbitant price, they had beaten and humiliated him in front of everyone. Now, he smiled ironically, believing that the apology should have come from them on that occasion. For the bandit, titles of nobility meant nothing. He intended to kill Damien anyway. The man lunged forward and cut the air with the blow, but Damien easily dodged. The criminal fell and hit his face on the ground. Before he could recover, he heard a cold voice. Damien thought he wanted to eliminate everyone there, but he wouldn't do it out of consideration for his family. The two Black Serpent members were defeated, but a new cry caught his attention. A reinforcement group was approaching. The leader asked who Damien was and if he belonged to any other gang. The boy replied that he didn't, that he had only come to settle a matter and file a complaint so that the owner would apologize. The man didn't understand and didn't care. He pointed at Damien and ordered everyone to attack him. The men advanced. Damien braced himself and, using his maximum speed, cut off the attacker's hands as he passed them. The leader was speechless. How could a boy demonstrate such skill? Damien cursed silently, surprised to be out of breath after only one attack. The leader tried to apologize, but it was too late. Damien chased after him, and, in moments, a jet of blood filled the air. Inside the tavern, people ate and chatted peacefully until they turned around upon hearing the door. They thought it was the leader entering, but it was Damien holding his body after breaking his neck. The boy let go and stated that all of this could have been avoided if they had paid attention when he tried to act kindly. Everyone watched as he wiped the blood from his face. He was seen as a lunatic. Many ran away immediately, terrified. Damien didn't want any of this. At least, with fewer people around, there would be less confusion. Then a man called the guards from the second floor. It was Anderson, the owner of the establishment. Damien calmly replied that if he was referring to the men outside, he shouldn't count on them. Anderson feigned surprise and asked why the boy was looking for a pretext for a disturbance. Damien explained that he had only come to receive an apology for the misunderstanding of the previous night, which had caused him a huge headache. Anderson pretended not to understand and asked, with a provocative smile, if that meant that the scoundrel from the Hassan family had no more honor to lose. Damien remained silent, only pointing at him. Anderson demanded that the young man pay for the damages caused and for the customers who had fled. The protagonist smiled at the demand. He had thought about forgiving him if he apologized. but he also saw no problem with the second alternative. Damien advanced with impressive speed, propelling his body toward the tavern owner. He felt Anderson also needed to answer for his audacity and the contempt he had shown towards the Haxon family. He readied his weapon, ready to strike the man, when someone suddenly appeared out of nowhere, visibly confused by the scene. The intruder intercepted the attack, and Damien immediately recognized that type of energy as soon as he landed on the first floor. Anderson showed relief at seeing Surtek intervene. However, Damien cut the moment short, coldly stating that Tech didn't seem like someone a regular tavern would have as a guard. He then demanded to know why a knight would be in such an environment. Knights trained their entire lives, following the path of martial arts. They went through 3 stages: apprentice, knight apprentice, and knight officer. The latter possessed absolute control over their aura, capable of crumbling mountains or reducing enemies to ashes. Anderson laughed, explaining that Tech was a knight apprentice very close to the leader of the Black Serpent. This information clarified the strange sensation Damien had had, that tiny fraction of aura he had perceived. He annoyed himself. How could he sense an aura if it hadn't even materialized? He declared that he didn't know either, as countless possibilities ran through his mind about why such a man would work in a tavern. Perhaps he had been expelled for lack of talent. Perhaps he wasn't even a real apprentice. Anderson interrupted to ask how much it would cost to eliminate the boy. But Tech wasn't swayed by the money. The mere mention of the word apprentice deeply irritated him. In a leap, he launched a direct attack. Damien narrowly dodged, not merely escaping. As he evaded blow after blow, he thought that this man possessed some real skill. Tech attempted another cut, which was parried with difficulty by the protagonist. But Damien's current body was beginning to give way. His strength was rapidly diminishing. "That annoying brat," Tech growled. "Let's see if you can escape this." He raised his sword and a cry echoed, accompanied by an abrupt change in his posture. It seemed to be a secret technique. Observing the transformation, Damien realized the danger. He closed his eyes for a moment, preparing to counterattack. But before he could act, his mind drifted to a distant memory. The flashback began with a man being killed by the legendary master assassin, someone whose reputation had spread like a dark legend. The assassin couldn't comprehend the Lord of Hell's plans. He thought that if all humans were eliminated, there would be no more fun. Thus, he refused to follow Dorgo and even dared to threaten the protagonist. Damien said nothing, only observed him silently. This attitude angered the assassin, who revealed his bloodlust without hesitation. He vowed to kill Damien in an instant. He advanced with his secret technique, Death Blade, and cut him in half. The battle lasted no more than 3 seconds. However, something grotesque happened. Turning around, ready to leave, the assassin saw something impossible. Damien's flesh was beginning to recompose itself, his tissues fusing together again. He seemed unable to accept it. He was an undead. Damien fixed his gaze on him, and the man froze in fear. Then, the protagonist split him in 2 with a single movement. The assassin didn't even have time to understand how his technique had been instantly stolen. The flashback is over. Back at the tavern, Surtek fell victim to the same skill. It always happened that way. That shocked expression was the last thing the enemies saw. From the moment Damien became a Death Knight, he gained the ability to copy and steal other people's techniques. Anderson, observing everything from the second floor, remained completely still. There were no tricks he could use. Seconds later, he and the guards knelt before Damien, begging forgiveness for having offended Viscount Haxon. They promised financial compensation. Damien replied that, although the amount wasn't exactly enough, he could let it pass this time. He called Victor and asked him to keep the money. The servant, while obeying, remained astonished. He wondered since when Damien had shown such kindness. Thus, the two left the tavern satisfied. Anderson, however, was already planning revenge. He considered warning the leader of the Black Serpent, but before he could finish that thought, a precise cut tore off his ear. Damien had used the Blade of Death technique again. All the gold he had received had almost made him forget to punish one of those involved. But Anderson reminded him that he still had something to settle. Damien declared that if he or the Black Serpent threatened his family, he would ensure that it would be the end of both of them. Staggering, sobbing in pain, and consumed by rage, Anderson walked away. He would plan his revenge another day. The protagonist knew that nothing he did now would erase the mistakes of the past, but there was something he promised himself. In this new life, he would not disappoint his family. So, Damien and Victor returned home as the sun was already disappearing on the horizon. Meanwhile, elsewhere, at Leon's March in Bloomy or something similar, a boy was observing his own image in the mirror and asking his brother if he had ever heard the phrase, "Pain always follows love." The brother didn't understand the reason for such a sudden question. When he turned to answer him, the boy announced that he was going out to find a love with a muamoe, or something similar. The next day, already at the Viscount of Haxon's mansion, Damien walked beside Victor and commented that he had slept soundly, like a baby. His servant, however, confessed that he hadn't been able to rest for a single minute, still disturbed by having seen people lose limbs the previous night. The protagonist showed no concern. Everything had turned out well, according to him. On top of that, they had made extra profit, and besides, the rumor would certainly spread quickly. Perhaps his reputation as a useless son would begin to change. Victor agreed that there was that possibility, but reminded him that the Black Serpent could retaliate. Damien reassured him, saying that if they tried anything, he would be there to protect the whole family. Victor admitted that the young master had great skill with a sword, but asked when he had learned to fight that way. Damien simply replied, as if it were something trivial, that he practiced from time to time. At that moment, a shout echoed down the hallway. It was Paul, running towards his son. He demanded to know where Damien had been, and if he had once again brought shame upon the family name. Calmly, Damien asked them to look at what Victor was carrying, a bag full of gold, scrolls, potions, and even the tavern's deed. His parents were incredulous as he explained that it was a small compensation for a recent misunderstanding. Paul insisted, asking if it wasn't Damien himself who had caused the problem. The protagonist affirmed that Victor had witnessed everything and, winking at the servant, added, "I'm sure he'll tell you exactly how it happened." Victor quickly confirmed, even without knowing how, and his parents finally calmed down, even congratulating their son. The servant, however, spent the rest of the day wondering if Damien might actually be an excellent liar. A few hours later, Damien ran as fast as he could. Exhausted, he leaned against a tree. There were so many tasks ahead, but his current body was too weak. He couldn't even jog. He took a small tonic from his pocket, something he had gotten at the tavern. Another brief memory came to his mind. He had asked what it was, and Anderson had explained that it was a tonic manufactured by the Alchemy Academy, created to increase stamina and energy. Damien remembered that this group was small, but extremely specialized in the production and evaluation of potions and tonics. Each of their products was worth as much as a magic stone. In other words, it was a stroke of luck. The memory faded. Damien opened the vial and drank the potion. He felt its effects immediately coursing through his body. He knew that to regain his strength, he would need to continue like this, gradually growing stronger. His mission was to regain the power of his former life, because in a few years Dorgo, the cursed skeleton, would resurface with an army of the undead. He needed to be prepared to eliminate him without difficulty. Only then would he be able to protect his family from the approaching danger. After reaffirming his resolve and focusing his mind on the goal he had set, Damien let out a long sigh and resumed running. The night wore on silently as he trained tirelessly. In Landworth, however, the Black Serpent's hideout seethed with tension. A man chewed irritably, cursing confused words. Before him, Tech, completely defeated, could barely remain seated, though he showed little concern for his own condition. Cedric Walker, the leader of the Black Serpent, watched everything with boredom. Among his subordinates, Tech was considered one of the best, but that mattered little. One of the members asked what they should do with it. Cedric replied that they should throw him in some alley. With money, losses could always be recovered. Trembling, Tijera tried to get up using his sword for support, but Cedric feigned sympathy and offered him another deal. As soon as he recovered, he could work for them again. The provocation aroused T's fury, who lunged to strike Cedric, but was interrupted when he felt his foot being grabbed by an unknown ability. Before he could react, his arms were also restrained, separating him from his weapon. "This man is the first target of my contract, sir?" someone asked. Entering the room, Cedric nodded. He needed to demonstrate his abilities. The stranger murmured inaudible words, and the energy that bound him spread throughout Tech's entire body, lifting him into the air and surrounding him with strange creatures summoned by the ability. One of them opened its mouth, and a drop of saliva fell onto Tijura. Terrified, he screamed for help, but it was too late. The creatures lunged forward and began devouring him alive, tearing off his limbs. His foot fell to the ground with a dry thud. Nothing remained. Cedric put his hand to his mouth, disgusted by the scene. The executioner asked if he was satisfied. Cedric replied that he was, but requested that next time he avoid something so grotesque. The man agreed, and Cedric explained the commissioned service. Someone had insulted the organization. Being a nobleman, it wasn't possible to attack him directly. Therefore, the job would be to torment him indirectly. The more suffering he caused, the greater the reward. But for now, he would only receive in advance. "Leave everything to me," replied the stranger, with a confident smile. Meanwhile, Damien continued training. The tonic had truly taken effect. A few days were enough for him to feel the difference in his own stamina. Still, something bothered him. Perhaps the black serpent wasn't even after him. This doubt hammered in his mind until he heard a noise in the bushes. He turned suddenly and grabbed the neck of whoever was lurking. But, to his surprise, it wasn't an assassin. It was Abel Haxon, his brother, the one who, in his past life, had been beheaded by his own hands. Damien froze for a moment before releasing Abel and offering him help. His brother refused with a hard look. He hadn't come there seeking apologies. Paul had said that Damien had redeemed himself in the tavern incident, despite having injured several people. How dare he lie so blatantly? Damien affirmed that it was the truth, but Abel reprimanded him, saying that he had never fought well and that the family had always covered up his mistakes. Damien, remembering how much Abel had always protected the family, placed his hand on his head and vowed not to cause any more trouble. At that moment, Victor appeared in despair, bringing bad news. The three rushed to the room where their parents were talking to the strange boy from before. He greeted Damien and placed on the table the proof of what had occurred at the banquet. It was something the protagonist feared, and, as far as everything indicated, this event had already come to pass. Erwin Leon Bloomer was taking advantage of the situation. Flashback. During the banquet, Erwin mocked Damien's sister. Ignoring the protagonist's explicit anger, he approached and whispered, "That girl is probably ashamed to have you as a brother." Damien couldn't stand it and punched him in the face, knocking him to the ground, but Erwin just smiled. Back in the present, Erwin said he had admired Miss Louise for some time. Paul didn't understand immediately, but Erwin continued. He wanted to ask for the girl's hand in marriage, and, if she accepted, he would forget the assault he had suffered. The family was shocked, except for Damien, who already knew the young man's opportunistic nature. Paul promptly refused. His daughter was already engaged, and they wouldn't change that. Erwin provoked him even further. "So you'd rather face my family than give me your daughter?" Louis entered the room, declaring that she accepted the proposal. Everyone was stunned. Abel also reprimanded her, saying that she shouldn't cover up Damien's mistakes. The protagonist lowered his head. It was like reliving the tragedy of his previous life. All his fault. Erwin smiled, calling him brother-in-law. Damien mumbled something inaudible and, without thinking, landed another punch, making him bleed. Lying on the ground, Erwin laughed. In his previous life, Damien was slow to discover the truth. His sister, eager to see him again, was found being beaten by Erwin. He threw her to the ground and struck her repeatedly, stating that he would teach her not to dare try to leave him. Damien watched helplessly. His sister suffered because of him. Erwin Leon Bloomer. His anger burned deep. He vowed that he would never forgive that wretch. Now, trapped in the present, he watched Erwin struggle to his feet. Two men entered, nervously asking if the young master was all right. Erwin took his sword, leaning on Damien's parents for support, and drew it, pointing it at him. His choice was made. He would not allow his love to be tainted, and he ordered Damien to prepare himself because now he would pay for what he had dared to do. The protagonist tried to calm the servants, stating firmly that he didn't intend to betray them and that he only needed a moment alone inside the stable. After seeing them leave, he decided to observe the horse on his own. The path left by the old man had guided him exactly to that point. The man manipulated dark mana, which made his identity as a dark mage evident. The protagonist's family seemed to have understood what had happened, and therefore, this was the best chance to follow the energy trail left behind. A violet light escaped from inside a nearby cave. It was the hideout of the mage who mocked Cedri, the leader of the Black Serpent. The truth was that the mage had tricked him into gathering certain items, claiming to perform a curse, when in reality he intended to use them for his own experiments, something particularly regrettable for him. The Holy Church had been persecuting him for a long time, forcing him to accept miserable jobs in exchange for money and refuge. Amidst the suffocating atmosphere, Damien found it repulsive and said, his voice echoing, that if the mage intended to be an old man who rarely bathed, he should at least ventilate the hideout properly. The man recognized him immediately. He realized it was the young man he had captured during an infiltration, the firstborn of the HZen family. The question arose, how had he found him? Damien stated that it was simple, for with such an imposing presence anyone would be able to locate him. The mage understood that he was not dealing with an ordinary person. After all, Damien had humiliated the Black Serpent. The mage gathered mana and challenged him to act with some honor. Damien replied with complete serenity that he had promised not to kill unnecessarily, but with one exception. All dark mages should be eliminated. The man perceived the danger. No normal boy would speak like that. He activated magical runes and launched consecutive attacks, but the protagonist easily dodged them all. Prepared, Damien advanced and cut the mage in half. The mage almost died, but activated his ability and his body began to recompose itself. It was the same technique he had used to escape earlier. He laughed at Damien, stating that this type of blow wouldn't defeat him. The protagonist, consumed by rage, charged again, declaring that he would find a way to defeat him. He launched a fierce succession of blows, while the mage congratulated him on his courage. The rumors about him were true. However, by entering the cave, Damien had sealed his own fate. He turned quickly, only to see his arm grabbed by a shadow creature, one of those responsible for Tep's death. The dark mage had prepared a trap in case the Holy Church located his whereabouts. Damien was alarmed, realizing that the situation was more dangerous than he had imagined. The wizard raised his voice, stating that Damien's body would be consumed and that he would regret facing an officer of Yulon. Darkness closed in around the protagonist, accompanied by the wizard's continuous taunts. Damien's memories returned. Cedri had ordered him to inflict the greatest possible damage on his family. If no one stopped him, the wizard would go after the young woman he had seen the previous night. Damien interrupted that train of thought and recognized the magic as a decay curse. The wizard didn't believe it. How could the curse not affect him? He asked how the boy knew so much about black magic. Damien remained silent, overwhelmed by something that confused him, for he still felt the authority's presence within him. At that moment, the flashback appears. Dorgo, Lord of Hell, celebrated the completion of a mission and looked at Damien, his best death knight, without understanding his discontent. Dorgo had granted him the most powerful body possible, but Damien still demanded more. His knight had to become the ultimate weapon. He cut his own palm after granting supreme power to one of his followers. Once absorbed, no mortal would be able to face him. He concentrated his magic, and a beam emerged from the receptacle. That was authority. He joined his hands and unleashed all the energy directly at his knight. The power was immense, and even Dorgo himself struggled to control it. The authority penetrated Damien's body, causing him to scream in pain. An intense flash marked the end of the fusion. Dorgo covered his eyes, astonished. His death knight now possessed the authority of God. End of flashback. Damien believed he had lost this power upon returning to the past, but the mark was still there. A magical attack was launched against him, and at the last instant, he managed to dodge it. The mage finally had his answer. The reason Damien knew so much about the dark arts seemed evident. Damien thought he had some tricks up his sleeve and stated, breaking the fourth wall, that it was called script protection. Returning to a serious tone, he recalled that the mage was an officer of Yulon, an organization specializing in assassinations involving black magic. It was not surprising that he possessed special abilities. The mage noticed something unusual about the protagonist. He understood that he couldn't prolong the fight simply by showing his bracelet. He mentioned his final resource, something he intended to use only against the church, but which was now necessary. A huge amount of black mana enveloped his body, spreading his mark completely. Damien was alarmed. The bracelet seemed to function as a mana reservoir. With his power amplified, the mage summoned a monster of infernal flames and hurled insults at Damien. This time, he believed the protagonist wouldn't be able to dissipate the attack. The blow was launched, hitting Damien directly. The mage thought it was all over. The flames had surely consumed him. However, Damien's voice echoed, revealing that the mage had misunderstood everything. He explained that the authority of greed wasn't meant to dissipate magic, but to release shockwaves from the user. In fact, Damien said, the tool absorbed every particle of dark mana from incoming attacks, increasing the strength of whoever wielded it. The mage despaired upon realizing he was facing someone with an authority. He asked how Damien possessed something like that, but the protagonist replied that it was none of his business. Damien assumed a fighting stance. He didn't like using the power granted by Dorgo, but he needed to in order to win. The mage recognized the sword Damien was using, the Aura Blade. Only those who reached master level could use it. Damien also used Soul Slash to prevent the mage's regeneration. The impact was so intense that it brought down part of the cave. The protagonist's strength was something that could not be ignored. The mage barely survived. Damien took advantage and pointed his sword at him, declaring that he would kill Indalos and reveal where the Serpent of Darkness was hiding. Hours later, already in the mercantile city of Landworks, Victor asked his master why they were going to the center again and, above all, what kind of dark book he was carrying. Damien stopped reading and explained that it was a grimoire of dark magic obtained after eliminating a foul-smelling wizard. Victor found it hard to believe. Even as an ignorant and uneducated servant, it was known that such books were dangerous and difficult to obtain. A strong odor caught their attention before the coachman announced their arrival at their destination. Damien was the first to disembark. Carrying a bag, he handed it to a servant and asked for a favor. Victor wanted to know what was inside, and the protagonist replied that it was a head, disbelieving that they would believe him. The servant checked the contents, thinking it was just another of his cruel jokes, but found in fact a real head. He screamed in despair and threw the bag. Damien retrieved it and tried to calm him down to avoid drawing attention. Then, the protagonist put his hand in his pocket and took out a notebook. The task that fell to poor Victor consisted of delivering 2 items to a specific destination, something he considered a great responsibility. The group had arrived at the Black Serpent's facilities, and the protagonist advanced towards the guards, calling them bastards with the coldness of someone who didn't want to waste time. He thought that, for such an organization full of pretension, they could at least have chosen a more discreet location, since the criminals didn't have the good sense to hide their hideout outside the urban area. The men before him didn't understand what Damien meant until one of them finally recognized him as the boss's target. The protagonist, pleased not to need unnecessary introductions, declared that he wanted to speak with Cedri. The guard replied indifferently, saying that if that was the reason for his visit, he could enter whenever he wished. His partner, however, raised a weapon and fired into the air, producing a flash that served as an alarm. The first guard mocked the protagonist, thinking that he would only see the boss if he managed to survive. On the rooftops, members of the Black Serpent watched, while others positioned themselves around them. Damien immediately realized what they were planning. It was an ambush. However, he thought that this kind of cheap trick didn't represent much of a challenge. A smile formed on his face as he admitted this aloud. While this situation unfolded, Bastian Backer, governor of Landwer, was enjoying the most extravagant luxury alongside us. Robert, the leader of the city's knights. It turned out that both had strong ties to the leader of the Black Serpent, and the two were attending a business dinner. Sebastian was willing to hand over the Red Light District. Cedri explained that the Red Light District, or simply Red District, was an area teeming with women and entertainment. As governor, Sebastian could easily suppress any complaints that arose. Robert joined the conversation, apologizing for not being able to offer something so valuable in return. But, for Cedri, serving as a city guard was already a prominent enough position. He commented that protecting so many people must be difficult, and therefore, the compensation needed to be adequate. If Robert accepted such praise, he would see that Cedri considered comfort, women, and drink a fair reward for any man. The two were carried away by the conversation, unaware that Cedri had other plans and that, if things continued this way, he would stop bowing to those he considered idiots. When the Black Serpent took complete control of the city, the power it would wield would be immense. The meeting was interrupted when a subordinate entered to speak with Cedri. To avoid spoiling the atmosphere among his guests, he preferred to listen to the follower from outside. As soon as he received the news, fury involuntarily escaped his voice. The guests were surprised to see Cedri distraught because of the magician. He believed the list of ingredients given was probably a fraud. However, in truth, he didn't care about that. In his mind, Damien would never be able to complete the mission, having gone there only to die. Outside the building, shattered vials littered the ground. The protagonist was making his preparations before the fight. After dropping the last empty vial, he charged at his enemies, cutting them in half without hesitation. Although there was another factor at play, Cedri showed no concern, for someone owed him a favor and would ensure Damien faced difficulties. However, a few minutes later, Cedri was sweating profusely. Driven by curiosity, he walked to the balcony to observe what was happening. To his astonishment, Damien had eliminated almost all the members of the Black Serpent. He began to doubt the man's identity, wondering if it really was the same Damien Hacks about whom so many derogatory stories were told. Cedri then understood that the hired magician had not deceived him. He had simply failed disastrously. Desperate, he ran back inside, seeking help, while his follower cried out for instructions. During the battle, one of the high-ranking members of the Black Serpent raised his staff and pointed it at Damien. He summoned fire and unleashed an intense blast against the protagonist. The man scoffed as he watched him rise, wielding only a sword against the flames. Damien, however, used the secret technique known as shadow revelation, manipulating the attack and returning it to the aggressor, who had no time to react and received the full impact of the powerful flame. With this, the protagonist eliminated the last members of the organization. He only had to enter the building to find Cedri, but a punch surprised him, forcing him to dodge at the last instant. The enemy's fist struck the ground with force. Damien felt a chill upon perceiving the energy emanating from that person, and concluded that it could only be an official knight. The passers-by, drawn by the commotion, began to watch. The city soldiers surrounded Damien, revealing only one possibility. Sebastian stood up, shouting how he dared cause such disorder in his city. Alongside Cedri, he vowed to punish the protagonist for his supposed crimes. Damien calmly asked why they were accusing him, stating that he had done nothing. Sebastian, indignant, claimed that he intended to attack Cedri, someone he described as kind and dedicated, merely trying to make a living as a merchant. Hearing this, the people laughed at the idea, commenting that no mobster ever deserved to be called a merchant. Cedri regained his confidence, believing that Damien wouldn't dare confront someone protected by the governor. The protagonist, however, showed no fear. He called Cedri over as if he were an animal, saying they had unfinished business and would only fight to resolve it. He even took the opportunity to mock Sebastian, calling him a corrupt politician who venerated criminals, and thinking he resembled Latin. The governor, feeling superior, offered to pardon the protagonist's 7 previous crimes, but Damien immediately rejected the idea. Exasperated, Sebastian ordered Robert to resolve everything. The knight walked forward, wielding his battle axe. He demanded that Damien show respect and surrender, explaining that acting bravely at that moment would only lead to his death. The protagonist found the way he defined courage curious and replied that it was confidence. To the knight, this seemed absurd. He struck the ground, and Damien jumped back. Although confident, he knew he didn't have the strength to defeat an official knight. Robert threw a punch, and Damien raised his guard, but the impact threw him far away. With a somersault, he managed to land. His arm, however, was badly injured. He wondered how long it would take for his allies to arrive. Robert attacked again, taking advantage of the distraction. Damien wouldn't have been able to avoid the blow, but at the last instant, a hooded figure appeared and blocked the attack with her own arm. The axe flew away. Cedri, Sebastian, and the soldiers were shocked. Robert, even more so, wondered if that hooded figure was an accomplice of the boy. Upon seeing her face, he perceived the imposing aura and beautiful eyes. She wasn't just graceful, she was stunning. Everyone recognized her attire immediately. She was a paladin. Hearing his name mentioned, Damien turned around happily. Victor had managed to bring help. The servant was drenched in sweat, but smiling. Cedri was indignant, questioning why a paladin was there. If the Holy Church had appeared, it meant they might have discovered something about the Dark Wizard. Damien reassured Victor, saying everything was fine and, jokingly, stated he would fire him if he delayed like that again. But more importantly, he thought that since the paladin had arrived, the plan had worked perfectly. Victor agreed, stating that there was no better man to carry out orders. Then came the brief flashback. Hours earlier, at the Holy Church, Victor arrived during a prayer. The paladin, dressed as a nun, observed him with surprise. He asked if this was one of the Holy Church's headquarters, although he thought that was already clear. She confirmed and asked what he needed. Victor quickly explained that his lord had sent him with a bag and a notebook that needed to be delivered as soon as possible, and also to inform her about the emergence of a dark wizard. The mention of the wizard made the young paladin's eyes widen, and she demanded that the items be handed to her immediately. As soon as she opened the notebook, she perceived the dark energy emanating from the pages and, above all, identified the symbol marked there. Without wasting time, she took the bag in her hands and opened it. But the abrupt gesture, pulling the strap by her hair, startled poor Victor. Inside was a Jito, one of Yulan's leaders, exactly as the wizard had described. For the paladin, that was enough. She declared that there was no more time to lose and ordered Victor to prepare to meet Damien and gather more information from him without delay. Now, that confident woman seemed to blush as she asked the protagonist if he had been responsible for the letter sent. When Damien confirmed, the young woman stated that she understood, and that, from that moment on, the Holy Church would take control of the entire situation. Both Sebastian and Cedri were uneasy upon hearing this. The girl, on the other hand, thanked the protagonist for the evidence provided and commented, surprised, that she hadn't expected him to be so kind and pleasant-looking, having imagined him instead to be impatient and explosive. She explained calmly that the Holy Church was made up of those who dedicated their lives to the service of God, known for their mercy and charity. However, when confronted with heretics or demons, they did not hesitate to reveal the fanaticism that made them feared. Therefore, the vanguard of the church could be terrifying. It was almost comparable to the most ruthless warriors of dark tales. And, at that moment, the good news was that this group was on Damien's side. The paladin then announced to the soldiers and citizens that the church had received information that someone there was collaborating with dark wizards. The crowd began to murmur. Many did not believe that anyone would be capable of bringing a heretic into the city. The girl continued her investigation until she identified all those involved and declared that Lanjuro would be under the church's administration. Sebastian immediately protested, saying that the king had not granted him autonomy and that he would never allow his power to be taken away. The paladin responded firmly, saying that eliminating heretics was God's will, and that the kingdom had no authority above that. She then stated that both Sebastian and Robert would be taken in for questioning. Cedri lost control and ended up revealing everything, accusing himself by saying that he was the one who made the deal with the Dark Wizard, and that his organization only got so far because of the support and protection of certain people. It was obvious there was a connection between them. The guilt was decided. Sebastian lunged at Cedri, trying to deny all the accusations, calling the paladin a liar with absolute conviction. However, she presented the evidence, the notebook belonging to the Dark Wizard, containing all the instructions given by Cedri. The governor was incredulous and cursed the wizard, asking who would be foolish enough to record their own atrocities. He also commented that it was worthy of a second-rate villain, and that he never imagined an adult would keep such a compromising diary. Even so, he insisted that it was all a mistake. But the paladin was not fooled and ordered that both of them be taken away immediately. The church members immobilized them and began to escort them away. At that moment, Sebastian finally understood. Damien was responsible for everything. It was absolute checkmate. He wondered what those fanatics would do now. Cedri tried to lean on Robert, saying that he couldn't give up, and that his strength would be able to stop this madness. Robert knew this. He could reach for his axe and fight. Perhaps it was his last chance to survive. He used his aura to break free and ran desperately, grabbing the weapon and advancing towards the paladin. Cedri smiled, thinking about how simple it was to manipulate someone like him. but Damien considered them both complete idiots. The paladin remained unfazed by the attack. With impressive speed, Yahello raised her fist and delivered a devastating blow that shattered Robert's armor. Cedric and Sebastian were left speechless. Damien, on the other hand, watched everything as if he already expected the outcome. The blow pierced the knight's body, and when the fist was withdrawn, a stream of blood gushed out. It was a fatal blow. She declared that whoever disobeyed God's will would be punished, no matter who they were, and she concluded with a solemn amen. Cedric now knew it was over. He still had to endure Sebastian's desperate insults directed at him. Damien and Victor approached, and the protagonist mocked the supposed mobster who terrorized the city. Cedric stared at them, consumed by hatred and disbelief, unable to accept that he had been defeated by a young man. Damien thanked the paladin for her help and commented that he imagined the extent of the sacred power she possessed. He even thought that perhaps she was capable of becoming a disciple of the great saint known as the Brigandine of the Blue Flame, a man famous for destroying high-ranking weapons. His thoughts were interrupted when she herself said that she also wanted to thank the young man, revealing that, since he had married a high-ranking officer from Yulon, the church would not reprimand him for it. The reprimand comment confused Damien. He saw no reason for being warned. The paladin explained that, to her, it was obvious. He had used the dark mage's case as cover to attack the black serpent. The protagonist apologized for the misunderstanding and explained that the mage had been hired by Cedric to attack his family, and he had only defended himself. The paladin remained silent for a few moments, until her gaze softened. Then she inclined her head and stated that she could not judge someone for protecting their own. She added that the reward for the mage's death would be given to him as soon as possible. 1,000 gold coins, enough to acquire an entire castle. After reflecting for a few seconds, Damien asked if he could ask for something else instead of the reward. Victor was incredulous. With all the fortune squandered in recent years, how could he refuse more money? Damien explained that he wished to obtain one of the mana cultivation techniques guarded by the church. The paladin didn't understand why he would need this, stating that the black serpent no longer posed a threat. In Damien's mind, however, the answer was obvious. He knew he had defeated the mage thanks to authority, but he wouldn't always have that same advantage. There would be powerful enemies in his path to Dorgo, and to overcome them he would need to strengthen his mana through rigorous training. Instead of admitting this, he simply stated that he wished to learn more advanced skills as a precaution. After observing him closely, she smiled and presented another proposal. How about, instead of a technique, joining the church itself as a paladin? The suggestion left him stunned. He immediately refused, frustrating the girl's expectations, who realized she couldn't accept such an answer. Becoming a paladin was extremely difficult, but also one of the greatest honors possible. Damien knew this and would never submit to living as a dog of the church. He thought quickly and said the first thing that came to mind. That day, he was not worthy of receiving God's love. His goal, for now, was to travel the world following his own path as a humble devotee. It was a weak argument, and the girl would certainly realize that. But, surprisingly, it worked. His words were accepted, and she decided to give him the cultivation technique, leaving open the possibility that he could become a paladin in the future. For Damien, this was a great deal. He didn't intend to join the church in any way. Only then did she properly introduce herself. Her name was Agnes, first disciple of the Blue Flame, and she carried with her the promise of a power that the protagonist would never forget. The protagonist stated that he considered it all a true honor. Apparently, he had encountered the most important disciple of that old saint. Now all that remained was to say goodbye to Agnes and complete the last tasks before finally being able to leave. Vito only wished to go home. For him, it had been too exhausting a day. A sudden shadow covered Cedric, who instinctively raised his face and, noticing that Damien was above him, had no chance to react before receiving a kick to the stomach. The protagonist watched the man vomit and thought, with a certain disdain, that the scene was even ironic. The wretch's own fat had served as a kind of protection, preventing him from being more seriously injured. Velos, irritated, kicked him again, now in the face, knocking out a tooth right there. Before the perplexed gaze of Agnes and Victor, Damien let out a light sigh, almost of relief. After so much trouble, he finally felt that something had been resolved. His servant, still nervous, approached and asked in a low voice if they could return to the mansion, since everything seemed to be finished. Meanwhile, in another distant region, belonging to the family of Marquis Lindoblam, a man burst through the corridors urgently calling for his son. Inside the room, there were only the butler and someone completely hidden under the sheets. Eswin was startled to recognize his father's voice echoing through the room. The man advanced towards him, grabbing him by the shoulders, demanding to know what had happened. Erwin Temoroso explained, his voice trembling, how he had almost been murdered with a fork and could barely finish his sentences. The father, consumed by fury, ordered everyone present to speak immediately. Who had dared to attack his heir? One of the guards replied firmly, "Sir, the culprit was Damien, of the Haxon family." The man stood motionless upon hearing that name, as if something inside him had simply stopped. It was revolting to imagine that someone so insignificant had harmed his own son. Several vases in the room shattered due to the intense aura that the Marquis released uncontrollably. Then he shouted that Damien should be captured and dragged by his feet like a dog. The following day, at the Haxon mansion, Agnes and her partner were greeted by Damien's family. Paul did his best to maintain composure, although, deep down, he only wanted to give his son a beating for bringing religious representatives into his home. He explained that the visitors were there only to investigate the recent attack by the Eliges. As a gesture of gratitude for their cooperation, the church offered a sum of money, which Paul accepted without hesitation. Once Damien's parents had calmed down, Agnes approached the protagonist to speak with him privately. He couldn't believe it. She had said they would see each other again soon, but he hadn't imagined it would be so soon, much less in his own home. Before he could get lost in thought, San commented that the matter was indeed important. She wanted to get to know Damien better, perhaps to help spread the gospel. His parents stopped immediately and stared at him, surprised to hear that their son had caught the attention of such a beautiful and devout young woman. Anne then handed the protagonist a special cultivation technique she had learned previously. Damien thanked her, but was intrigued to realize she was giving him 2 books. She calmly explained that one technique was for cultivation and the other for the destructive sword. It made no sense to practice only one without understanding the other. And she also commented that obtaining those works had been a difficult process, as there had been resistance within the church itself. Without giving him a chance to respond, she continued, saying that her master had also shown interest in meeting the young man after hearing accounts of his deeds. Holding his hand, she asked again, "Could you perhaps reconsider and become a paladin someday?" Damien immediately withdrew his hand, making it clear how uncomfortable he felt with her insistence. Anne understood the signal right away, apologized for insisting so much, and added that he could contact her if he changed his mind. As she walked away, the protagonist thought that she hadn't exaggerated when she described herself as overly fervent. Her dedication was truly extreme, to the point of worrying anyone. Sometime later, in Ajito's old hideout, the Dark Wizard's companions searched the place, commenting amongst themselves on how strange the whole situation seemed. One of them questioned how someone who had escaped the Holy Church for so long could have been defeated by a boy with such limited experience, especially considering that Damien had been at a disadvantage against magic. The others merely sighed, pretending to share the same doubt, even though they also didn't believe they had much room to investigate further. Both suspected that the protagonist was hiding something. Agnes interrupted the conversation, saying that she trusted her own intuition. Besides, Damien had already explained how he had eliminated the wizard. They recalled the moment when the protagonist said that he simply dodged the attacks until he managed to cut off the enemy's head with his sword. Still, one of them found that absurd. He remembered that, when he received Ajito's head, he had observed Damien before entering the fight and had seen him defeat several enemies, even dodging a fireball, a true spell. His companions were speechless. "There's only one category of people capable of this," Agnes commented. Advanced swordsmen were known for blocking magic with their own techniques, and although Damien didn't seem to have reached that level, his immense potential could have made it possible. For this reason, she explained, the main objective was not only to investigate the case, but to try to convince him to join the church. The 2 companions nodded. Having someone like him on their side would be an extraordinary asset. In another region, a group of 3 knights advanced on horseback. The apprentice Orlies thanked the Lord for finally approaching their destination. Levander, also an apprentice, complained about the smell of the countryside and cattle. Their leader, Gary, ordered them to be quiet. They were envoys of the Leon Blumen family, whose name always seemed to generate doubts among them. Upon arriving back at the Haxon mansion, Gary reviewed the mission's objective, and Ulpi replied that they should capture Damien Haxon and drag him like a dog. The leader was deeply angered by this. For him, that punishment was insufficient given the humiliation suffered by young Master Erwin. As they walked, they passed an old man, which caught Gary's attention. The old man didn't look away for a second, walking as if he didn't notice their presence. When they finally addressed him, he turned around confused, asking who they were. As soon as he confirmed he was a member of the Haxon family, he was immediately beheaded. Gary sheathed his sword, cursing himself for not having knelt before the knights of the Leon Blur family. Orlies and Levander were perplexed. The old man seemed blind. How had he managed to see them? But Gary didn't care. With a satisfied smile, he declared that he had just had an idea. Shortly after, while Victor was clearing the entrance to the mansion, he heard the knights approaching. He sensed that the group intended to attack everyone there before taking Damien. Back at the church, they lamented the fact that they couldn't investigate as they would have liked, since the place had been partially destroyed by the collapse. Then something caught the attention of the 3. Damien was using the destructive cultivation technique. Agnes was speechless. That method allowed one to absorb mana from the environment when mastered at a high level. But how could he have achieved such mastery in just a few hours? When Damien finished his training and opened his eyes, he found the trio watching him with silent admiration, but also with astonishment. He asked if they were finalizing the investigation at Agito's guard post. Agnes confirmed and took the opportunity to congratulate him on his extraordinary progress. Damien didn't respond immediately. In his thoughts, he understood why the paladin had emphasized so much the difficulty in obtaining permission to use that technique. Destructive energy had clearly been developed to compensate for the extreme energy expenditure of its counterpart, Destructive Sword, creating a perfect combination of attack and recovery. When he returned to reality, he noticed Agnes blushing as she looked at him. To avoid any awkwardness, he suggested they all return. However, at that moment, he felt an intense thirst for blood. He turned to Agnes, stating that he had something urgent to attend to and asking her to return at her own pace. He assured her there was no reason to worry and left quickly, surprising the group with his speed. The paladin understood, above all else, that such speed could only be achieved by someone with incredibly refined mana control. She wondered how far the boy's limits would go, feeling a mixture of surprise and unease. With Levon's strength reinforcing her attack, she struck Victor directly in the stomach, causing him to fall to his knees, and then continued to mercilessly strike him for daring to confront her. Even so, Victor did not reveal where his master was, nor did he give any indication that he planned to harm him. At that moment, Paul rushed out of the mansion, shouting for the knights to stop immediately. They recognized him as Viscount Haxon, but Paul merely bent down to support his injured servant. Indignant, he asked the knights why they had attacked a civilian with such cruelty. Gary stepped forward before anyone else could answer. He declared that, given the humiliation inflicted on his family, beating an overweight boy meant nothing. Then he formally announced, "Viscount Paul Haxon, Grand Marquis Leon Bloom demands the head of your son, Damien Haxon." Paul cursed, furious. He had expected some retaliation for the events involving Erwin, but this had gone too far. Gary was clearly lying, and Paul realized that even if he handed over Damien, the knights would likely destroy everything around them. Gary, however, seemed to have foreseen that response and gave his final order. Ulpies and Levander should devastate everything until they found the boy. Paul desperately begged them to stop, because there was no need for such brutality. But his plea was interrupted. A presence laden with murderous intent froze all the knights in place. None of them had noticed the boy until that moment. Levander, shuddering, wondered who the young man could be, but he didn't dare speak. His mere proximity made them feel an oppressive pressure. The protagonist walked over to his father to check Victor's injuries. He had been beaten so hard he barely seemed conscious. Filled with rage, Damien addressed the knights. He said they were lucky Victor possessed a body strong enough to withstand so many blows. Gary replied that the boy's ego didn't matter, and that the trick used to defeat young Erwin wouldn't work against trained knights. Damien found this strange. What was he talking about? There was no trick. He was simply stronger than that worm. Gary then sent his knights to attack. Lavender advanced to cut the protagonist, but was easily blocked. For Damien, this was the perfect chance to test his newfound strength. He twisted Lavender's arm completely and, with a powerful punch to the chest, threw him several meters, silencing any attempt at a scream. Overcome with fear, Ulpies couldn't react and received a kick that knocked one of his teeth out. In seconds, both apprentices were defeated, lying on the ground at the hands of their rival leader. At that moment, Victor slowly opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was Damien protecting him, asking how he felt. Even in pain, Victor raised his hand and gave a thumbs up, maintaining a weak smile on his face. Damien was surprised. Even after being beaten so badly, Victor could still joke around. He was truly a unique person. Gary dismounted from his horse, determined to speak with the boy. He admitted he hadn't imagined Damien possessed such skill. Observing how he had defeated 2 apprentice knights, it was understandable that he had caused Erwin so much trouble. The protagonist replied that it didn't matter, and that his strength was none of their business. This comment, however, seemed to reveal something to Gary. He declared that he had finally understood everything. To him, it was clear, "You are not the real Damien Haxon." That statement took everyone by surprise. Where had Gary gotten such an absurd idea? He ordered them to stop trying to deceive him. According to him, it was obvious that the real Erwin would never lose to a nobleman of low rank. The Haxon family, in their distorted logic, had probably hired a mercenary to impersonate their son and humiliate the Leon Bloom family. Damien watched the knight gripping his sword tightly and mentally concluded that he must be an idiot. One of the apprentices regained consciousness, but preferred to feign further unconsciousness to avoid further humiliation. Paul, worried, helped Victor, while the servant firmly believed his master would win. Gary carefully assessed his opponent. Although the boy was talented, in his opinion, there was still a chasm between an apprentice and an official knight. A single swift strike would suffice. He advanced with his technique, called Lion's Veil, but Damien blocked the attack and taunted him, saying he expected more from someone sent by the Leon Bloom family. Regardless of how he phrased it, Gary recoiled, confused, wondering if it had been luck. He unleashed a series of attacks, all promptly intercepted by Damien. Irritated, he cursed the boy. But it was clear that his speed was no match for the protagonists. Damien then counterattacked, slashing the knight's face. Gary couldn't keep up. He soon received a kick to the head, throwing him to the ground and dragging him across the dirt. In agony, he ended up on his knees before Damien, who stated that this would be the punishment for injuring Victor. Gathering his strength, Gary stood up using his sword for support and unleashed his aura. Consumed by fury, he activated his ultimate technique, the Supreme Lion's Speed Sword. Damien took his position, prepared. The moment the blades clashed, the knight's sword shattered, and the protagonist pierced his shoulder, tearing off his arm completely. Gary fell backward, defeated. Paul watched the scene, terrified. While Victor celebrated his revenge, Damien turned his head upon hearing Gary's muffled cries, desperately trying to staunch the bleeding with his own aura. The protagonist pointed his sword at him, and Gary finally yielded, begging for mercy. He didn't know who the boy really was, but he pleaded not to die there. Damien replied that he didn't know where he'd gotten that story about being an imposter, and that, besides, it was too late for regrets. Attacking the Haxon family and beating a servant made it impossible to ask for forgiveness. The knight suggested putting an end to it, but Damien interrupted him, saying he was apologizing to the wrong person. Gary looked terrified at those approaching. He still had to face Victor and Paul. Gary repeatedly banged his head on the ground, pleading. Paul watched hesitantly before turning his gaze to his own son. Damien understood what this meant. The final decision would be his. If he executed them, he would provoke a war against the Leon Bloom family. If he let them go, they would return for revenge, and he wouldn't be able to defeat them all while trying to protect his family. Then someone called his name. It was Agnes, questioning what was happening. Damien had an idea. she could be the solution. A few minutes later, the paladin understood the situation and found a simple way to help the Haxan. Because of Damien's intervention against Egido, the Dark Mage, he technically had the right to be considered an ally of the Holy Church. The protagonist hadn't thought of that. Agnes was absolutely right. Paul and Victor didn't know if this was a blessing or a complication, but it seemed to be the only viable alternative. Damien held Agnes's hand, pleading with her so intensely it seemed like a proposal. She accepted exactly as he had hoped. Paul and Victor were stunned to witness it. The man had managed to influence everyone simply with his appearance, and this deeply irritated Damien. Then he turned to Gary and his men, asking if they had clearly heard his words. It was essential, according to him, that they inform the Marquis that the Hax family had received official protection from the church. If they truly understood this warning, they would never again threaten his family with intimidation or displays of force. Leon Blom's knights hurried away, quickening their pace while inwardly giving thanks for still being alive. Victor tried to comfort him, saying that they could finally breathe in peace, but Paul stated that no, there was still much to resolve. They would have to convene an urgent family meeting and plan, with extreme care, each step ahead. Shortly after, all the Hax family members gather in the dining room, with Agnes present. Paul begins the conversation by explaining the situation involving the L. Blooms. Abel raises his hand, confused, since, in his view, the protection granted by the church meant that all conflicts had been resolved. His father explains that they couldn't simply depend on the church for everything, as it generally didn't deeply interfere in disputes between noble families. Furthermore, the Leon Blooms possessed other means of harming the Hax besides military power. Clearly, a plausible way to preserve their swords would be to seek the support of a high-ranking noble. Upon hearing this, Anne immediately interrupts him, remembering another possibility. She mentions that the respected Lord Damien could become one of the paladins of the Holy Church. The protagonist hadn't imagined she would bring up this subject in front of the whole family, and, as on other occasions, promptly refuses, which leaves her completely frustrated. Aeljarti, driven by impulse, forcefully slams his fist on the table, startling everyone. The tension in the air grows. Why didn't they simply pressure Damien? With all the trouble he'd caused over time, it would be fair for the young man to become a paladin to protect his own house. While Anne smiles contentedly, Veril continues to insist, claiming there was no more room for hesitation. Paulo, irritated, stares at him silently, aware that there were guests present and that his table-banging behavior seemed like that of a spoiled brat. Even though he was bored, Damien knew he had no choice but to obey his father's decisions. Paul agreed, though without complete conviction. After all, despite having triggered the conflict, the young man had done so to prevent his sister Loy from falling into the hands of a despicable individual. And, as the man responsible for the house, he didn't intend to back down. So he stood up, calling Damien by name. The protagonist lowered his eyes, but Paul firmly grasped his shoulder and congratulated him for protecting the family's honor and for confronting the Leon Blooms fairly. Damien replied, in his thoughts, that there was no reason for thanks. It was merely something he felt obligated to do. Paul said he understood, but declared that from then on he would assume all responsibilities himself and fulfill his role as a father. At that moment, someone bursts into the meeting. The butler enters, saying he needs to communicate something urgent. Paul asks what the problem is. The answer leaves him perplexed. The young Master Damien had taken out a huge loan, offering the family's wheat fields as collateral, and the repayment deadline had already expired. Damien turns around, muttering curses, aware that, despite having traveled back in time, he had forgotten many reckless decisions he had made in the past. Paul grabs him furiously, calling him a bastard and vowing to finish him off. Soon after, a man introduces himself with a certain formality, saying it had been a long time since their last meeting. It was Olan Demichi, manager of the western branch of Dash Akash, or something similar. Damien doesn't recognize him immediately, but he was sure that this man was the one who filled his head with seductive talk that led him to sign the contract for the family lands some time ago. Without remembering the amount of the debt, Damien asks how much he owes. Olan's answer takes his breath away. The young man had borrowed 200 gold coins, and with the accrued interest, the total reached 300. Damien feels a shock, trying to understand what his former self was thinking. If things continued like this, his family would end up in poverty. Olan reminds him that the lands were the collateral, and regardless of whether they were noble, the contract had to be honored, as Duke Gold Prixier himself had ordered that all debts be collected, regardless of the debtor's status. Then, demanding payment, Olan watches Damien begin to sweat, noticing the evident discomfort. The collector asks if he hadn't managed to gather the money. Damien replies honestly, he hadn't prepared anything. Olan shows surprise, but soon smiles cruelly and reveals his true character, sitting down as if he owned the place, putting his feet on the table while ridiculing the protagonist. He claims that Damien should never have taken out the loan if he knew he wouldn't be able to repay it. Then, he snaps his fingers, ordering his henchmen to surround the young man. That was the part of the job he enjoyed most, according to him. Whenever a nobleman unable to repay a debt begged like a dog, it amused him deeply. He eagerly awaits to see what expression Damien Axon will display in that situation. Meanwhile, Paul paces back and forth in his room, trying to calm himself. His wife and daughter plead with him to trust Damien, but he refuses. Paul and Abel state that they can no longer bear the pressure. The family's future is at risk. Merylda tries to calm him, reminding him that Damien had left his problematic behavior behind, and Loy agrees, saying that his brother had already resolved several difficulties. Paul admits that this was true, but that it was all due to the young man's physical strength. He lacked any diplomatic skills. Elsewhere in the house, Damien knocks one of the thugs to the ground. Olan is horrified. He hadn't expected such an immediate reaction, but Damien only laments having ruined the floor. Having fixed the problem, he advances towards the second henchman, and, with a swift leap, subdues him as if moving with the precision of a snake, grabbing him by the neck. In his mind, the protagonist reflects on the irony of the situation, being attacked on his own property. His reaction could be considered self-defense. Olan screams, terrified, as his accomplice is defeated in seconds. Damien slowly approaches, asking Olan to calm down so they can talk. He explains that, at the moment, he has no way to pay the debt, and therefore there will be no payment. Olan, trembling, replies that this is not a problem. Damien then holds him by the shoulder and suggests another way to settle. The man agrees, unable to imagine what would happen if he refused. The next day, Abel talks to his father, saying he's disappointed. He finds it unbearable to see Damien getting around everything through brute force. It deeply irritated him. That Abel is a hater, someone in the house thinks. His father asks him to stop this behavior and support his brother, even though he himself isn't completely convinced by the plan. Even reluctantly, they needed to trust each other. As the time for parting approaches and comes to bid farewell to the protagonist, who thanks her again for all the help offered, she replies, in her thoughts, that this was natural, since the hacks had also rendered a great service to the church. She wishes that Damien's journey be blessed by the Lord, so that he returns ready to join them. Damien, however, interrupts her before she finishes the sentence. He already knew what she intended to say and had no intention of changing his mind. After saying goodbye to everyone, he checks with his servants if the luggage has already been loaded and enters the carriage. Impressed by the comfort of the interior, he accompanies the group, pleased to see that the transport seemed adequate for them. Damien appreciates the change in the coachman's behavior. Midway through the journey, they stop to eat some lobsters. After that, he orders them to continue and signals to the driver that the journey should proceed. The protagonist's destination was evident, the residence of Duke Gold Pixie. After a short journey, Damien finally arrives at the Golpisha estate, a place that truly reflected the wealth of the family considered the most prosperous in the kingdom. The protagonist thanks Olan for his services and especially for arranging the meeting with the Duke. On, however, only hopes that everything goes wrong, as he wishes to avenge the humiliation he suffered, and therefore lies when wishing him good luck. Damien is about to enter when Olan, from behind, gives him the middle finger. Inside the mansion, he is greeted by the Duke of the Apple Kingdom, Adam Goldspixie, who directly asks the reason for his visit. The protagonist declares that he feels honored to be before him, but Adam, impatient, tells him to be direct, as he had other commitments. Damien explains to the Duke that he had incurred a large debt, using his family's lands as collateral. and that he had been unable to raise the necessary funds to pay it off. Therefore, he was there to ask if there was any other way to compensate for the amount owed. Both Davia and Damien volunteer to defeat the Leon Blooms, suggesting this as a possible form of payment. The reaction of those present is immediate. The Duke, his guards, and even the knights show surprise at this audacious proposal. Adam Sar realizes that the rumor surrounding this had already spread, and his guard Jael confirms that the entire Apple Kingdom was talking about it. In fact, the news spread rapidly among everyone. In recent days, a large gold mine had been discovered right on the border between the two rival families, and since there had never been harmony between them, the tension had only increased. Because of this discovery, the final decision would be made in a duel between knights of lower rank, and the winner would gain control of the mine. Damien already knew the outcome of this confrontation, a resounding victory for the Leon Blooms. From this triumph, they would expand their power using the enormous wealth they would acquire, destroying the influence of the Gulpies or Gulpies, as they preferred to call them. For Damien, this was more than just an opportunity. It was a decisive moment. He could defeat Ullman Bloom, prevent the Bloom's dominion from growing, and at the same time, fully repay his debt. The Duke shows appreciation for the protagonist's ambition and takes the opportunity to ask him if the rumors involving Erwin and the Black Serpent were true. Adam is impressed by the scale the gossip had reached and replies that yes, he had indeed accomplished such feats. "You really are a tempting person," Adam states aloud. "I was just looking for a skilled knight to represent me in the duel." Damien says that, if that was the case, he no longer needed to look. He claims to be the ideal candidate, reminding him that he was right there, before him. The Duke reacts with doubt. He questions whether Damien would truly be able to defeat the eldest son of the Leon Blues. The protagonist, however, declares with absolute confidence that he could. In his thoughts, he belittles his opponent, turns red with anger, feeling ridiculed. Convinced that they were underestimating him, he immediately asks the Duke for permission to teach the protagonist a lesson. Adam reflects for a moment before agreeing. Soon after, the scene shifts to the arena, where the fight would take place. Victor watches everything in confusion, not understanding how they had gone from a simple conversation to direct combat. He imagined there would only be negotiations, and the fact that his master's opponent seemed extremely dangerous made him even more apprehensive. The Duke authorizes the reducer to begin the duel. The knight plants his lance in the ground, offering Damien one last chance to surrender. The protagonist merely yawns, feigning boredom and taunting his opponent. Bedf unleashes his aura, determined to do everything possible to prevent Damien from blocking his final attack. He lets out a ferocious cry, raises his energy-infused spear, and leaps with impressive force. Damien positions his sword to defend the blow, but Arshur changes trajectory at the last instant. Aiming directly at the protagonist's chest, Damien reacts in time, but the blade of his sword splits in two. The knight smiles, insulting him, before advancing with a blow that pierces the protagonist's armor, piercing his chest while releasing the spear's aura. The Duke shows immediate concern, while Victor screams in despair, believing his master had been killed before everyone.